I want to begin, and I'd like to welcome all to the fourth presentation of the Crossing Borders series, focused on questions of leaving home, making new lives, and sustaining communities. The series is sponsored by the Georgetown Americas Forum, which I am honored to get to direct, and co-sponsored by the Georgetown Americas Initiative. I'll just briefly introduce myself. Your moderator for today, I'm John Tutino. Again, I am the director of the forum, and I teach the history of Mexican communities over the long haul and in some global context here at Georgetown. I will remind all that the webinar will be recorded and posted on the events page of the Georgetown Americas Institute in about a week. And I will say all of the first three are now up and posted and available to consult if anyone would like to. I will add that in our last 15 or 20 minutes or so, we will turn to engage questions from our audience. And I'll remind you now and again toward the end to please join us by opening the Q&A box and typing in your questions, and then I will pass them on to our guest presenter. Today, the presentation is entitled Urban Origin Migration, Industrial Monterrey in the Mexico-US Migratory System. Our presenter is Professor Ruben Hernandez Leon, who is in the sociology department at UCLA, as well as serving as director of the prestigious and important Latin American Institute there. And before he took up that role recently, he was longtime head of the Mexican Studies program at UCLA. He's the author of Metropolitan Migrants, The Migration of Urban Mexicans to the US, a pivotal study of the links between Monterrey, Mexico, and Houston, Texas, thus both an urban and in many ways industrial migratory link. And he is co-author of Skills of the Unskilled, Work and Mobility Among Mexican Migrants, which takes key questions to broader domains. With that, it's my pleasure to pass the screen to Ruben Hernandez Leon. Ruben.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work and to actually revisit some of my old interests on the role of Monterrey in the US migratory system. I think I'm going to get straight to business here. I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see the PowerPoint presentation. Let's see. Yes. So thank you again. Thank you, John. Thank you. Many thanks to the organizers and to all the people who have been working hard on the logistics of putting together this series of events. I've actually attended most of them, and they've been extremely interesting. I've learned new things, and it's been a pleasure actually to connect again with you, John, and with actually former students who have gone to take on a scholarly career. So this is wonderful. So the title of my presentation today is, as you saw, Urban Origin Migration, Industrial Monterrey in the Mexico-US Migratory System. And I will begin by saying that in this presentation, I combine or bring together these different disciplines, different approaches, history, geography, sociology, and even a little bit of autobiography to actually explore the role of cities as origin, destination, transit spaces, and hubs of infrastructure of and for migration. Interestingly enough, when we think about cities that play a significant role in the U.S. migratory, Mexico-U.S. migratory system, we often think about cities like Tijuana, like Ciudad Juarez, which have a long history and a very strategic position because they're border cities. In this case, we are going to be I'm going to be presenting on a city that is, in many ways, a kind of border metropolis without being strictly at the border. And that is actually the case of Monterrey. That is, of course, close enough to the Texas-Mexico border in Northeast Mexico, as you can see there on that map. And I'm going to ask broadly and try to shed light on what is the role of Monterrey in the US-Mexico migratory system. The title of my presentation is a little bit misleading because I will not only talk about Monterrey as a point of origin, it's going to be one of the things that I'll be covering, but I'm going to be integrating parts of more recent research, particularly on the role of Monterrey as a key, if not the most important hub of processing of H2A and H2B temporary workers who are essentially the new braceros. And there are very, very strong similarities, as you know, historian Mireya Loza actually presented and explained before me. So first, I begin with the history and geography, so everybody can situate Monterrey, Mexico in the larger North American space and in the history of the relations and the connections between Mexico and the US. So the first thing that is important to note is, of course, that in the 19th century, there was a cataclysmic event, right? The war of Mexico-US war that actually re-established the border between the two countries after the US annexed the northern territories of Mexico. And that event was particularly important for Monterrey because it actually brought the border close to the city, right? Before that, it was a big expanse, Texas and more. And after 1848, and after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Monterrey was very close to this new redrawn international boundary between the two countries. And that cataclysmic geopolitical event actually created new opportunities for the local mercantile elites in the second half of the 19th century, who together with immigrant capitalists, local capitalists, of course, invested profits in industry around the latter part of the 19th century. And so with the advent of the Porfirian regime, the Porfirian government, and its policies of modernization, Monterrey actually became more integrated, more economically integrated with the United States. Those economic connections actually deepened through infrastructure, and Monterrey started to become slowly but surely as a hub of economic activity that had deep ties and connections with the United States, and of course with its hinterland in Northeast Mexico. So much that as merchants started to transfer capital to industry, various kinds of industry, heavy industry, Monterrey actually turned and became, in economic history of Latin America, a case of early industrialization, right? Because there were a number of key investments in foundries, in the production of beer, and ancillary industries that actually started to make and to turn industry into a very central part of the economy of the city and the identity, I would say, also of its inhabitants. So during the post-revolutionary reconstruction, right, sometime between the 1920 and 1940, Monterrey continued growing as an industrial hub. You have a picture there on the right of the screen, which is downtown Monterrey in 1930. But after the transformations brought about by the revolution, Monterrey also started to look more towards the internal market. And in fact, the city emerged as the most important urban industrial center in northern Mexico, and a key city in this model that Mexico followed from the late 30s onward, called import substitution industrialization. If you're not familiar with this term, this was an economic model, a set of policies that not just Mexico, other Latin American countries, other Latin American economies followed, starting more or less around that period, that tried to or sought to foster, to cultivate native capital, to create and establish national industries that would satisfy in the internal market. That model then prioritized the internal market, and at the same time received very strong support from the state, from the government. Right, the idea was create a more independent national economy. Hence the term import substitution. Industrialization, the idea was to develop industry by producing locally, nationally, more and more goods that used to be imported, right? So in that context, Monterrey, together with cities like Monclova in Coahuila, and other cities in the country, became sort of key parts of this project, or this model of import substitution industrialization. As a result of these, the growth, as a result of industrial growth, Monterrey became a magnet for internal migration, right? That internal migration, of course, has not just one cause or source. It has multiple ones, but one of them, of course, was Monterrey's tremendous economic growth around mid-20th century. And Monterrey begins to grow significantly as a result of internal migrations coming from northeastern, north central Mexico and beyond, also other states in the country. Many of these migrants were coming from the small cities, small towns, rural areas of neighboring states, again, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Zacatecas. San Luis Potosí was a very, very important state of origin of many migrants, many internal migrants who actually made Monterrey their new home, right, in the 50s, 60s. And I actually thought of including a very important study, or the cover of the book of a very important study that was published in the early 70s, called Men in a Developing Society, in English, in Spanish, El Hombre en una Sociedad en Desarrollo. And this was actually by Jorge Balan and Harley Browning and Elizabeth Jelin, who, these are social demographers who studied Monterrey as sort of an emblematic case study of internal migration development, and this was a very, very important study that very innovative from the point of view of social demography, and it fundamentally focused on this internal migration. The book deals, with men, hence the title. And the authors actually estimated that in the 1960s, nearly 70% of the adult male population in the city was of immigrant origin, right? So this is actually a huge proportion if you think about it. These were the migrants who were coming from all of these neighboring states to take on these jobs that were available in industry. Of course, the early internal migrants of the 40s, 50s, 60s became part of the industrial working class, but latecomers, certainly by the 1970s and later, encounter more sort of difficulties finding jobs in industry, and many joined the informal economy in Monterrey, which was also growing by this time. So in many respects, Monterrey has a strong identity of being the destination of these internal migratory flows. And some historians actually who have studied the working class in Monterrey have argued that, through the ideological workings of the industrial elites and the industrial bourgeoisie in Monterrey, the working class actually developed almost an anti-migration ideology of self-sufficiency, right? If you wanted to work, if you needed a job, you could find one easily in Monterrey. You didn't need to go to the United States for that. Interestingly, Monterrey was also became in the mid-1950s a processing center for the Bracero program. Here you have actually one of the famous pictures taken by Leonard Nadel on braceros, and this is a picture of braceros who were being processed at a processing center in Monterrey before going to the United States, right? And they are lining up by state, and so this is actually a very interesting. It's something that not a lot of people in Monterrey actually know about, but at some point around this time, the estimation is that about 4,000 braceros pass through Monterrey every day to receive documentation before they embarked on their journeys to the United States. And here you have another picture of braceros, and you can see them as lining up as they're about to take the bus. I actually purposefully chose this picture because in the background you can see a mountain, the silhouette at least of a mountain called Cerro de las Mitras. And my parents' home is actually at the foot of that mountain. So this is actually, I grew up not very far from where those braceros were lining up before, embarking on their journey to the United States. But the Bracero experience in the Bracero program, in some ways, worked as a kind of foil for the industrial elites, the industrial bourgeoisie in Monterrey, because they often contrasted the suffering, the travails of braceros in the United States to contrast them with the virtues of local corporate paternalism, right? Well, braceros were working under the sun, were humiliated by American employers. Local workers were in factories, contributing to national development, national progress, and embraced by, respected by these companies that offer them things that were very similar to the sort of Fordist model in the United States, right? Lifetime employment, a social wage, a series of benefits, and stability, right? Interestingly, when we think about Monterrey's place in the North American migratory system, of course, we have to think of Monterrey as a point of transit for these braceros, right? And I'll come back to the relevance of that later in my presentation. But actually, returning braceros, many returning braceros eventually settled in Monterrey. When I conducted fieldwork in that city for my book, Metropolitan Migrants, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I actually discovered many homes, many households who had former braceros. And the story they told me was very similar. Many of them had worked, taken on multiple trips to the United States, had returned, and had used their savings to finance an internal migration, what was essentially an internal migration, a rural to urban migration, from their villages and ranchos and small towns in Mexico to Monterrey. Those savings were actually very important because they had provided a kind of foundation for that move. Many of these former braceros had used some of that money to buy urban land, for example, right? And they later on built a family home in many of the working class neighborhoods of the city. So Monterrey was not only again a point of transit, but also a point of return and settlement of former braceros under sort of the cover of an internal migration. Now things started to change in the late 70s and early 1990s. As many of you know, Mexico's model of import substitution industrialization started to crumble at that time. And the country and its political elites and economic elites began a shift to a different model, a different economic model, export-oriented industrialization. And that crisis and that period of restructuring that followed changed the realities on the ground in Monterrey. Instead of continuing as a sort of receiving city of internal migrants, Monterrey actually started to send its own abroad, right? And in the 80s and during the 90s, both decades had very strong and lengthy periods of economic instability, devaluations of the Mexican peso and so on. Many working class households that had enjoyed stability during the period, economic stability during the period of the Mexican miracle, during the heyday of import substitution industrialization, started to face unemployment and a downgrading of industrial jobs. Many of the benefits that were provided by these big companies, these big vertically integrated conglomerates of local capital in Monterrey, started to sell their assets, to close their doors, and to withdraw or provide fewer and fewer benefits to these employees. This is something that impacted the working class, but it also impacted some of the middle class members in Monterrey who were also employees in some of these companies, right? Not on the assembly line, not on the shop floor, but actually in offices and conducting white collar jobs. So some of these working class households, of course, begin to engage in US bound migration as a way to cope with the effects of the crisis and the economic restructuring that followed. And this is, what it's sort of the heart of my book, Metropolitan Migrants. In that book, I go in detail into, the kinds of social networks that they utilize in order to migrate, the conditions of migration. For example, most of these migrants actually moved to the US without authorization, but they were not the archetypical undocumented migrant, because many of them were able to access border crossing cards or BCCs, which is a type of visa that is widely available or it used to be available to working and middle classes in urban northern Mexico, right? So many of the members of this sort of labor aristocracy that developed in Monterrey were able to get visas to visit the United States, right? To go to South Texas for shopping and so forth and so on. Of course, these tourist visas do not allow or entitle the holder to work in the United States, but those documents, of course, facilitated crossing the border tremendously, right? And when we think about ideology and identity and things of that nature, it is interesting. It's interesting for me to recall how many of the workers who I interview, now 20 or more years ago, actually they did not see themselves as undocumented workers because they actually had documents to cross the border, even though they might end up working without authorization. Some unemployed professionals also ended up moving to the United States. And I don't know of many studies that have actually gone in depth into the experiences of these unemployed professionals who ended up working or moving to the United States. But I actually remember in the 1980s in Monterrey how people who had worked in these local corporations, local companies, very successful at the time, ended up being recruited by US school districts who actually needed bilingual teachers. Some of these individuals were actually bilingual to a certain measure, to some extent, and they were ideal candidates to actually to be recruited and work as assistants and eventually as teachers in US school districts that were actually being impacted by the huge wave of migration that was unfolding and that continued well into the 2000s. So these industrial workers, mostly male industrial workers turned migrants, actually transferred skills. So this is another way in which the migrants from Monterrey diverge from the profile of the sort of rural Mexican migrant. These are individuals who maybe did not have necessarily many more years of education, but they actually had a lot of experience working as technicians, as precision welders, as machinists in industrial pursuits in Monterrey, and then when they migrated to places like Houston, they were able to find sort of a fertile labor market to transfer their skills, right? So I have here a couple of pictures of workers in the neighborhoods where I conducted fieldwork in Monterrey. These are workers in some of the places where they were employed in Texas, producing parts for the machines and the infrastructure that service the oil industry in Houston. And not everybody, of course, ended up being able to transfer the skills that they had acquired and developed through many years of labor and work experience in Monterrey. Some, precisely because they didn't have documents, ended up working in dangerous and poorly paid jobs like asbestos removal, just to give you an example. Interestingly also, some of these migrants returned to Mexico and transfer skills that they had upgraded in the US back to the Monterrey labor market. Some of them managed to accumulate savings and started to embark on or launch their own machine and tools business, for example, which are so common and so widely available in Monterrey. But as this story was unfolding, the story of Monterrey as a place that was sort of expelling its own, right? That was sending its own to the United States. Another story was beginning to unfold. And that was the story, a somewhat familiar story of Monterrey becoming a key player in the expansion of the H-2 visa program. It is not a program in the strict sense of the term, like the Bracero program. We have to remember here that the Bracero program started as a bilateral program between Mexico and the United States. H-2 visas are actually just types of visas that the US uses to recruit temporary workers. However, I often use the term program or scheme because in many respects, these H-2 visas and things that I'm about to explain work a lot like the Bracero program. There are key differences, but there are lots of similarities. So these visas were not new. The H-2 visa was not new, but it had been used for decades to hire Jamaican workers to labor in the sugar fields in Florida, Louisiana, and then in other states of the eastern seaboard. But by the late 1990s, the number of H-2 visas begin to grow significantly. There was a sort of dip in the trend during the period of the Great Recession. There was another even smaller lull as a result of the disruptions created by the pandemic. But in fact, hundreds of thousands of H-2 visas in two categories, H-2A for agricultural workers and H-2B for non-agricultural workers, are being issued now to nationals of different countries, but mostly Mexicans, right? Mexicans are about 90+% of those who receive H-2A visas, agricultural again, and H-2B. It's a smaller percentage. It's about 74-75%, depending on which year you're looking at. But in both categories, Mexican nationals clearly dominate. I conducted a preliminary tally just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago maybe, of the H-2 visas in those two categories that were issued in 2021, and I counted 311,000 visas issued to Mexicans alone. So we are talking about very, very significant numbers of documents that allow Mexicans to work temporarily and legally with contracts in the United States in a way that is very similar to the Bracero program. Now, what does this have to do with Monterrey? Well, Monterrey has emerged as the global capital, the world capital of the H-2 visa processing. It has become the most important processing center for H-2 visas, and that has to do in part with the fact that the U.S. consulate in Monterrey has developed a tremendous capacity to process thousands of H-2 visas in a single day, in a way that sort of makes us think about what happened with Braceros in the mid-1950s, right? In 2019, just to give you an idea of how significant this is, 68% of all H-2 visas issued in Mexico were actually processed in Monterrey. And this, of course, translates into this. This is something what you can see on the screen here. I have some pictures for you. Thousands upon thousands of workers streaming through Monterrey, staying a few days, right, in local hotels, in the sort of old downtown, the old central part of the city, awaiting, going to interviews at the U.S. consulate and so on to receive these documents before they go to the United States to work. One of the things that I'm studying nowadays is precisely this H-2 visa scheme, H-2 visa program, and one of the things that I can tell you about the work that I'm doing is that this visa scheme is, and these thousands of workers that go through the city are actually guided by a well-oiled brokerage apparatus of recruiters, U.S. contractors, document processing firms, transportation companies, and other services that actually, constitute a kind of infrastructure, a kind of migration industry, as I like to call it, that facilitates migration to the temporary migration to the United States. And in some related work that I'm doing, I see I've been able to sort of assess that at least some people from Monterrey are participating in the program, right? Because Monterrey, in some surveys, is appearing as one of the top 10 places of residence of H-2 workers. So although a lot of these, particularly the H-2A visa privileges, people who have experience working in agriculture, at least some residents of the city are actually also participating in the scheme, perhaps in the non-agricultural jobs of the H-2B visa. But these are the scenes that you actually can see in any given day, more during the sort of high, the peak of the recruitment season, which is February, March, right? If you happen to walk through the streets of downtown Monterrey. A few more pictures that give you a sense of the kinds of companies, right? Transportation companies, companies that help you process your documents, that help you, assist you in completing particular forms, hotels, you name it. a whole range of service providers, from people who will, photocopy your documents to companies that offer transportation in cars, vans, buses, and so forth, all the way to guys like the one that you see on the left there, a street musician entertaining some of the workers before they actually embark on those buses and go to work in the US, right? And of course, all sorts of street vendors and so on. More recently, a new chapter has started in Monterrey's sort of position and role in the North American migratory system, and that is Monterrey as a transit, but also a settlement place for new migrants from Central America and the Caribbean, specifically migrants who have been recently, who have tried to apply for refugee status in the United States, but who have been asked to wait in Mexico, essentially turning Mexico into a station or a holding area, just like Morocco is in North Africa or Turkey in the Middle East. And well, this is playing out in different parts of Mexico, certainly in many of the border cities like Tijuana, like Juarez, Reynosa, Matamoros, et cetera. It's also playing out in Monterrey. So just as you see those new Mexican braceros, these H2 workers getting ready to go to the US, now you can see Haitian migrants, Haitian families, Central American migrants who are trying to make a living while they wait for news about their refugee applications for asylum in the United States. This has brought about a new interesting development, and that is the expansion of the humanitarian infrastructure, or what I and others call the rescue industry of migrants and refugees, right? Shelters and soup kitchens managed by churches, governmental and non-governmental international organizations, right? Like UN offices that have opened spaces in Monterrey to assist these refugees/migrants, local governmental and volunteer institutions, all involved in assisting migrants. And of course, not surprisingly, smugglers, coyotes, transporters, and document processors who are finding in this population new clients. So I'll just summarize some of my findings here. Monterrey, of course, has played a role, while not being at the border in a strict sense, has played a role of a border metropolis in the Mexico-US migratory system, right? Because it has been for decades now a space or a place of transit of migrants going north, coming home, and also a hub, a very important hub for the kinds of infrastructures, formal and informal infrastructures that facilitate emigration. And this is also a place where return migrants, as we've seen with braceros, but also with the more recent wave of deportees, Mexican deportees, or people who return in a quasi-forced, quasi-voluntary way back to Mexico, right? They are relocating in the big cities of Mexico, Monterrey being the second largest city, where they can actually use some of their human capital, including language skills. So many of these deportees are working in call centers in Monterrey, in the informal economy, and they are also accessing educational opportunities. So again, in the 1980s and 1990s, Monterrey saw the outmigration of skilled and semi-skilled industrial workers, middle-class professionals. And that was a very interesting moment because it really conflicted with this sort of ideology of self-sufficiency that the local elites had cultivated in the city for decades, right? This idea that if you were a hard worker and you were looking for a job, you didn't need to look very far, and there was no reason to go to the U.S. You could find these opportunities locally, right? And it was all about discipline. It was all about being a hard worker, and you would make it in Monterrey, right? And I didn't have to talk. I didn't have time to explore these in this presentation, but more recently, also Monterrey has become an exporter of human capital, and that is not entirely surprising because it is one of the most important university centers in the country, and certainly the most important university center in northern Mexico, with multiple public and private universities. And as the two economies have become more and more integrated, and U.S. companies, and Mexican companies also, for that matter, operate on both sides of the border and globally, these companies are actively recruiting college-educated Mexicans in those with advanced degrees in the universities and the sort of college-educated labor market in Monterrey. And with that, I conclude. Thank you again, and I'm eager to read and answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. My first response is the historian in me has to say that the long-term overview is so revealing. Having gone back from Monterrey as a recipient of migration to the back and forth to now being a center of passing through. And I too am going to have to very briefly put in a little bit of family autobiography. So when Browning and company were doing the Men in a Developing Society project in the early 70s, my wife and I were students in Austin, Texas, and living a shuttle through Monterrey and Saltillo regularly to Mexico City. And while we passed through repeatedly, my wife was actually taking courses with Harley Browning, whom she found one of the finest teachers she ever had. So that whole project very much resonated in our lives. And I want to recommend to anybody, there are classic studies worth going back to. And I will add, as Ruben suggested, that this is one of those studies, that it's an earlier stage of migration, but very important to understanding this set of migration. So we have a first question from Thomas Costigan, who is an MA student, or was an MA student in Latin American studies. And he asks, so when they say remain in Mexico, does that mean that the folks gravitate back down the road to Monterrey as opposed to staying near the Mexican border? And while they're in remain mode, can they find jobs in and around Monterrey?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So it's a fairly complicated story because many of these migrants coming from other countries may find a way of making it all the way to the border, right, with the United States, only to find out that they are not allowed in, that they have to wait in Mexico, and many stay in those cities, right? But some of them voluntarily and not end up in cities like Monterrey of the interior, right? Because the Mexican Immigration Service actually has been involved in trying to move these migrants and reduce the concentrations of these migrants in border cities to other places in the Mexican interior. they can find work in Monterrey, and a lot of this is work in the informal economy. Many of them have, work in some of the markets, right, where really no documents are required or asked. Some of them begin to develop sort of small street businesses, and in general, by and large, they're trying to survive. There are these sort of humanitarian support infrastructures, shelters, and so on that are helping them, but they are actually um, quite visible, partly because of the phenotypical variation, right? And you can see, for example, Haitian migrants in Black migrants in different parts of Monterrey, and it's very interesting. Some people also playing the role of Good Samaritans, offer to hire them, right, in their businesses, conducting, sort of support or help. And it's one of the most sort of recent chapters, right, that connect Monterrey to not just now the North American migratory system, but the entire continental migratory system.
Thanks. Sonia Plaza says, thanks, Ruben. It's interesting to see how Monterrey, being an industrial center, has become a center for outmigration, returnees, and transit migration. What has been the integration process of the transit migration and the reintegration of returnees? And as a second question, is there any order of magnitude for the recruitment costs and coyote fees charged?
I don't have recent information on the latter, but I mean, we know, let's say anecdotically, that some of these new migrants who are at various times at a point of sort of desperation because the waits are very long, resources are not abundant, find a way of, relatives paying for, coyotes and smugglers. And in Monterrey is also a hub for the coyote industry, and has been for quite some time, due in part to its proximity to the Texas border and so on. The integration process for returnees is quite interesting, because this wave of Mexican returnees, as some of you might know, involves children, and this is actually stands in contrast with previous waves of returnees, right? When mostly men used to go to the United States and came back, regardless of legal status. If the family had stayed behind, well, it was the man who either rested before going back to the US or found some sort of temporary work. Now, many of the returnees are actually families who have been impacted by deportation or the deportation of one of the members. Sometimes the decision to return has to do with family reasons, right? A gravely ill parent makes children go back, right? The problem is, of course, that it's expensive and very dangerous to try a new migration. And so when children come back, children who have spent time in the United States, you have to take into consideration the integration of these children into the educational system. And that actually has been a very sort of interesting and complex part of this new episode, or this new chapter as well. there is a very interesting and dynamic binational group of scholars working on the integration of Mexican children into Mexican schools, right? Some of these children maybe grew up in Mexico, spent some time in the United States, but many of these children are actually US citizens who are not returned migrants in the strict sense of the term, right? They are actually first-time migrants, and they are coming to Mexico, moving to Mexico with their families, and their encounter with Mexican public schools, the Mexican educational system, with academic Spanish, it is or resembles very much the experiences of many other migrants who are going for the first time to a new place or a new destination, right? Yeah, it's a very interesting and also complex, multi-dimensional process, precisely because it involves the return of many families as well.
Thanks. And now, continuing our ongoing process of conversations among our presenters in the series, Mireya Loza asks, during the era of the Bracero program, residents of Monterrey were not always happy with the large numbers of Braceros migrating to Monterrey. In the present day, how do locals feel about the H-2A workers in Monterrey?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you, Mireya, for that. Because this new Bracero transit flow is very sort of restricted to an area of the city that doesn't have a lot of people living in it, right? It's businesses, hotels, and actually a great deal of concentration of this migration industry infrastructure. There are not tons of situations where sort of locals and these compatriots coming from other parts of the country sort of interact, right, or have face-to-face interactions. I can just once again, by way of an anecdote more than anything, can share with you that many of the locals in the middle class see these sort of migrants as probably they saw the Braceros, coming from these sort of rural, less developed parts of Mexico, and they sort of, I think in some ways this sort of contributes to revive and to keep alive, replenish this ideology of self-sufficiency that is so common in Monterrey, right? So extended among the working class, the middle class, and so on.
Thanks. We wait a minute, see if others in the audience. I want to raise an issue of change over time. One of the powerful impacts of the work in Metropolitan Migrants was you're really bringing to the focus the migration industries and making it clear they very much, it wasn't all they did, but to a great degree, they functioned to integrate Monterrey and Houston. They kept people going back and forth and integrating them. Now you raise this new diverse migration industry in the era of H-2A. Is there similar orientation to integration, or are they different kinds of migration industries reflecting perhaps different trajectories?
That's a great question. Thank you, John. I think that your question is sort of hinting at the answer. I think that this is a different kind of industry because it's a different kind of migration. These couriers that I studied, back in the 1990s. Coyotes who were actually from the same neighborhoods where these migrants were from. Actually, yes, work for integrating, for keeping families in touch, for moving people and goods in this sort of binational circuit, right? That had Monterrey and Houston as its two ends. The migration industry of the H2 program, H2A and H2B, is sort of a different animal because it is a migration industry that works to as a kind of, as I always sort of see it, as a kind of machinery or a machine that is in support of these, temporary migrant labor program, right? And it has some very interesting points of contrast, friction. I've written recently about how these recruiters and contractors, for example, try not to recruit, although this is difficult to do, in areas that have extensive experience of migration, parts of Mexico that have extensive experience of migration, undocumented migration. And that has to do with the fact that they see these workers from Jalisco, from Michoacan, from Zacatecas, from the historic heartland, right, of migration, where people have a century of experience and a century of accumulated networks and social capital in the United States, as not pliable enough. They cannot control these people, right? And so if there's colleagues here in the U.S. on the East Coast, etc., in the Southeast, who have studied extensively how some of these H2 migrants, if they are humiliated or mistreated on the job, they have the ability to abscond because they have the most developed and sophisticated networks in the US, right? They have cousins and aunts and uncles and siblings living, within 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of where they are working, right? And so this has, for example, these recruiters that are part of the H2 migration industry try to go to areas of the country where there is or there has been less migration, right? Where workers have less of that social capital that would allow them to become more autonomous in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And rebellious if needed. So thank you for pointing out at that, because yes, we are talking, broadly about sort of facilitators, but what they facilitate, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I want to pick up on what you just taught me, because I have sort of had the image of the H2BA, the new bracero, right, as simply perfecting in the U.S. interest the man comes, the man goes, right, and he's in control and he delivers the work we need, period. What you have suggested is that those migrants from the traditional regions, who may be a problem to some of the recruiters, have found a way to mobilize this to maintain some of the transnational familial links that the old system helped maintain. And shall we say politely, the new greater attempts to seal the border has tried to make it harder to live that rotating transnational life with families on both sides of the border. But you're telling me that at least meaningful numbers of Mexicans have found ways to use the H2A to keep those binational links alive.
Absolutely, that is completely, that is correct. And this takes many forms. Very if not entirely surprising, still very interesting forms, because some H2 migrants, for example, um, were present in the US without authorization, and they went back. Sometimes they went back on purpose to actually become temporary workers and to be able to cross the border legally. And to that extent, and through those means, to be able to see families who actually reside in the United States. And so the story of the mixed status family in the US for some migrants has acquired an even more complex dimension, right? Because now you have people who are some members who might have been born here, others who have no status, others, young people who have DACA, and then now you have a parent who is an H2A or H2B worker, right? And who's able to kind of like circulate to the extent that there are contracts available, of course, right? And a small minority of workers actually get these visas with the purpose of absconding because they want to reunite with their families. And this is a question that I've asked recruiters, and they give me, various estimates of, the number of people that they take and the number of people who come back. And so this new Bracero program, and this is I'm preaching to the choir here because of the historians in the room. But this new Bracero program, of course, is not happening and growing against a blank slate, but actually, built upon layers and layers of migratory history between the two countries.
Yeah, and I want to say, to me, I've always had the sense that whatever restrictions either or both countries have tried to impose, meaningful numbers of Mexicans have found the creativity to make the systems adapt a bit, if not work fully for them, become viable for them, allow them to carry on. And you've opened sort of new senses of how that evolves in the current era. So that I find exceptionally important to have learned today. I want to raise, because your final point, and I want to take two pieces of your talk and sort of bring them together to you a bit. So here's Monterey, primary point for organizing, administering H2 visas for temporary workers. And as you said, are overwhelmingly going to Mexicans. We hear so much about the Central American flow. And over we hear that now Central Americans are far more those trying to migrate without documents, getting caught, getting sent back. And with the Remain in Mexico, they're going to Monterey. I mean, in part, I want to, so it's essentially, if I'm hearing right, Mexicans have been enabled to have access to the H2 program. Central Americans shall, it appears, minimally at best, or almost not at all.
That is correct.
What you have shown us is that those two groups are converging in Monterey. They are focusing in this amazingly pivotal, again, I'm hearing, I've figured out, thanks to so many people who studied it for me, how pivotal Monterey has been for a long time. And here I see another pivot, these two flows. Is there any hint of their interactions? Do they know each other? Do they see each other? Do they think about each other? Do they encourage each other? Do they perhaps not like each other? What sense do you have of that at all?
My sense is that they don't encounter each other that much. Actually, the Central Americans might be more in contact with the local population, as Mireya was asking, because to the extent that the Central American migrants are stranded in a way, they have to stay longer, and they have to find spaces or space in working class neighborhoods, right? Where, rent and other resources are cheaper, and where they can find also jobs in the informal economy, in the construction industry, for example. There is regulation in the construction industry in Mexico, but not so much in residential construction, right? Like it happens in the United States as well. So I think that many locals are the local population is interacting more with the Central American and Haitian flow these days than these H2 workers, because these H2 workers, I mean, part of what I find interesting, and I should not be surprised, but H2 visas, H2A and H2B, have a tremendous, a very high percentage, very high proportion of success rate, high success rate. That's what I'm trying to say here. That is, out of 100, let's say, again, the numbers vary by year, but in any given year recently, of every 100 applicants, 90 plus receive the visa, which only speaks to how well-oiled this machinery is.
Yeah.
And part of the job of this machinery is to put this, get these workers, put them through the various stages, and get them through Monterrey, and get them stay just as long as is absolutely necessary before they move them to the US, right? So it's 3 or 4 days at a maximum. They are all, for the most part, I don't want to use the word isolated, but in a way they are isolated, because they all stay in those hotels in downtown Monterrey that cater to this transit flow, right? And then they're on their way, right? Whereas the Central American migrants, they are there, if not to stay, they're there for a while.
Yeah. And I'm going to try to, and if I'm hearing right, the H2 visa applicants, overwhelmingly Mexican, actually are engaged with a legal, documented, sanctioned system, the government and the contractor, right? Whereas the remain in Mexico refugees, by definition, are in a world of informality, are dealt with by NGOs, informal workers, et cetera, et cetera. It's two different, in a sense, systems.
Right.
And I must admit, when I hear the generality, well, Mexican migration, Mexican migrants aren't hitting the border so hard, it's all Central Americans. And I hear the implication that means life is better in Mexico. Mexicans don't need to migrate. I'm having a little reaction that sort of says, but in part, a system has decided to facilitate Mexican migration,
yes,
while keeping Central American migration, I'll politely call it, constrained. And it's again, you given me wonderfully new complicated things to think about in all of this. We have now a question from Glenn Williamson, and he says, has NAFTA, now renamed, increased the employment opportunities in Monterrey for maquiladora plants? Would this help keep local jobs?
Actually, these already sort of happened in the 1990s, late 1990s to throughout the 2000s. So the story of Monterrey's economic crisis and industrial restructuring is not a history that ended with the industrialization. It's a history that ended or continued with reindustrialization, precisely because of NAFTA. And in some ways, when I was preparing my presentation, I actually thought of a bullet point. NAFTA came to the rescue, because it did provide, or it did create, it funneled many investments to Monterrey in the way that, of course, increase the sort of supply of industrial jobs, and not just in maquiladoras the way we think about maquiladoras, but much more sort of complex industrial facilities, right? Where it's assembly plants, but these are assembly plants that are, use advanced technology that produce very sophisticated, fairly sophisticated products. When you land in the Monterrey International Airport and you drive to the city, you actually go through one of the industrial corridors that has this sort of imprint of NAFTA. And what do you see? You actually see Whirlpool, General Electric, all the big companies that produce appliances for the US, Canadian, and Mexican consumer market. And obviously these are much more complex and sophisticated products, right? And so Monterrey went through a process of reindustrialization, while at the same time, like in many other big cities around the world, the service sector, the service industry emerged as really the most important source of jobs for people locally.
You early on talked about the mix of industrial employment and informal employment in the early rise. Has the mix remained about the same? Has it shifted in favor of formality or informality with this reindustrialization? If you can hazard even a guess.
Well, it's difficult to hazard that guess, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that Monterrey does not look like sort of an deindustrialized city.
Yeah.
On the contrary, right? It is a sort of a very thriving industrial place, but following developments that are taking place all over the world, it has also changed in fundamental ways its economic base.
Yeah.
Where it's not the old heavy industry place, it's an economy that has lots and lots of services. The medical sector is huge. People from the US go and take care of their teeth in Monterrey, or find doctors that have just as good as training as anybody in the US for less money. And many other services, right? And again, I think it's interesting and important to think about the the role, of course, of that universities and university centers play in that in that context.
Yeah. Great, thanks. How will I punctuate that? The family that hosted us in Saltillo, all those shuttle trips back in the 1970s, headed then by a local pediatrician. Now the eldest son is a leading physician in Monterrey, and a major and first-rate medical provider. I am going to say thank you so much, Ruben. This has been enlightening, interesting. You've opened my mind to many things. I'm presuming I know you've opened others just as well. I also want to thank our audience, participants, remind all that we now take a respite for precisely a month from the series. Georgetown goes into spring break next, a week from today. And exactly a month from today, we will come back and take up urbanity on the other side of the border, in which George Sanchez from USC will discuss his long-term understanding of Mexican Los Angeles in the context of his recent new book on Boyle Heights, followed soon after by Georgetown's own Mike Amezcua, bringing us to Mexican Chicago. And so we're going to keep urbanity at the center of this for a while. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Ruben again, and invite you all to follow our listings and join us again in a month. Thank you much.